It began, like so many tragedies, with a day that was supposed to be perfect. October 17th, 2018. The air in the great Smoky Mountains was crisp, washed clean by a night of gentle rain. Leaves shimmered in hues of ember and gold, falling like feathers in the breeze. That morning, a seasoned outdoorsman named Keel Morita, 37, signed in at the Klingman's Dome Trailhead Registry with a casual scrawl. Accompanying him was his 14-month-old daughter, Emiko, nestled snugly in a red-framed child carrier backpack. They were supposed to complete a popular 4-mile loop through the park's highlands. It was a path Keel had walked dozens of times before. But by nightfall, they hadn't returned. And they never would. At first, there was no panic, only mild concern. Keel was an experienced survivalist, a part-time guide, someone who respected the woods and knew how to navigate them. His wife, Naomi, assumed he'd chosen to stay the night at one of the backcountry shelters to give Emiko a rare experience under the stars. But by the morning of the 18th, with no contact, her confidence faltered. By midday, park rangers were alerted. A search team was deployed. Within hours, the situation transformed from precaution to emergency. The command post bloomed like a tented village near the trailhead. Helicopters buzzed the ridgelines. Thermal drones swept the canopies. Dogs sniffed discarded trail mix wrappers, hopeful for ascent. Volunteers combed mossy paths in grid formations, calling Emiko's name into the trees like a prayer. Everyone had a theory. Most believed Keel had slipped on the rocky ridges above Deep Creek with his daughter on his back, that he'd been injured, immobile, waiting somewhere just off the trail. A few wondered if he'd been attacked by a bear, though rangers pointed out that black bear incidents were exceedingly rare and seldom fatal. But Naomi refused to accept any of it. "They're not gone," she told a local news crew through tear-rimmed eyes. Keel wouldn't let anything happen to her. He would die before letting her get hurt. Her words were unknowingly prophetic. For a time, it felt like the whole world cared. Social media campaigns rallied under hashtag #FindKeelAndEmiko. National news outlets ran special segments. Naomi, ever composed, appeared on daytime talk shows and morning broadcasts, holding up the last photo take of the pair. Keel smiling beneath a green cap, Emiko giggling over his shoulder. Tips flooded in. A trucker swore he saw them walking near a rest stop in North Carolina. A retired schoolteacher claimed Keel came to her cabin, disoriented and injured. Psychics mailed letters describing a hollow place of water and stone. Rangers investigated them all. None led anywhere. Then came the discovery that cracked open a sliver of hope and closed it just as quickly. 2 weeks into the search, a local hiker found a rusted compass near Clifftop Ridge. It was antique, oddly pristine given the elements. At first, it was believed to be Keel's. Naomi even said she remembered him owning something like it. But a historian from the Appalachian Artifact Society identified it as an early 20th century model, likely lost decades ago. A coincidence. Nothing more. It was a blow. Each false lead chipped away at the mission's momentum. By the 6th week, media interest waned. Winter was approaching, and with it came the silent pressure to move on. The official search effort was scaled down. One by one, the ATVs, helicopters, and search dogs disappeared from the landscape. The tents collapsed. The trail registry was wiped clean. The forest closed in. And then the whispers started. First online, then among the locals. Whispers that Keel Morita hadn't vanished. He'd fled. The theory was seductive in its cruel logic. Keel was too good, too skilled to simply get lost. He knew those woods better than the average ranger. If a man like that disappeared, it had to be by design. Some suggested financial trouble. Others speculated marital strain. A few said Keel had always seemed like the type to go off-grid and raise his daughter in some survivalist hideaway, free from society's constraints. The Appalachians, after all, are littered with myths of hermits and ghost families living in forgotten hollows. Naomi heard it all. It was like being stabbed again and again. First, they took her husband and child. Then they came for his reputation. She knew better. Keel was devoted, not perfect, but fiercely loyal. Emiko was his heart and Naomi. though exhausted from grief, never once doubted that his final thoughts had been protecting their child. But she was alone in her certainty. As the official narrative hardened into a grim sort of folklore, Naomi's world grew smaller. Friends stopped calling. News crews vanished. Donations to the search fund slowed to a trickle. And still, she kept searching. She sold her car, cashed in her savings, and hired 2 private investigators. They reanalyzed GPS tracks, re-interviewed hikers who had been on the trail that day, and pored over satellite photos from October 17th. Nothing. On weekends, Naomi hiked alone. She would mark sections of trail with red chalk, pushing herself deeper into the park, sometimes retracing areas that had already been cleared. Her hope wasn't to find them alive anymore. That fantasy had quietly died, but she needed closure. A clue, a scrap. Sometimes she'd find herself standing on a ridge, arms crossed over her chest, staring out into the endless blue-green waves of the Smokies, wind in her hair. Alone. Years passed. Eventually, the National Park Services quietly marked the case inactive, not closed, never closed, just shelved. The Nakamuras became part of the forest's long story, another entry in the ledger of disappearances that haunt national parks. People spoke of them in the same breath as lost hikers, plane crash victims, or children who wandered off during family vacations and were never seen again. But Naomi never stopped listening, and neither did the mountains, because 5 years later, on August 1st, 2023, a strange red shape was spotted halfway down a sheer granite face in an untouched sector of the park. An area so remote it had no name, no trails, just stone and time and silence. And in that silent place, beneath 1 billion tons of Appalachian earth, a secret stirred, the kind that changes everything, the kind that doesn't just reopen a case, it tears it apart. The mountains had their own way of keeping secrets. In the days following the disappearance of Keel and Emiko Morita, a small army descended upon the southern sector of the Smoky Mountains. Park rangers, SAR teams, dog handlers, and volunteers combed the area with a kind of manic hope. Naomi, wrapped in a jacket 2 sizes too big, stood by the ranger station each morning, clutching a photograph of her husband and daughter, lips cracked from praying. For the first week, they believed they would find them. Helicopters circled low, rattling the treetops. Dogs barked at every turn in the trail. Radios crackled with updates. False leads, crushed ferns, a footprint near a stream. But no trace of the child carrier. No sound of a baby's cry. No rustling tent or makeshift shelter. The park swallowed them whole. By day 10, hope began to rot into something else. Ranger Elias Van, the soft-spoken lead on the case, convened a press conference. He stood in front of a tangle of cameras and reporters, face drawn and voice tight. "We have suspended active search operations," he said. "Barring new evidence, we will pivot to long-term missing person protocols." Naomi didn't blink. She just stared forward, like if she moved even an inch, she'd shatter. What followed was a slow unspooling of public faith. Online forums ignited. Conspiracy theories bloomed like mold in the dark. Maybe Keel wasn't who he claimed. Maybe he staged a disappearance. Maybe Naomi had something to do with it. The internet demanded motives like oxygen. Why would a man disappear with his infant daughter in one of the most rugged parks in the U.S.? A Reddit thread titled, "The Trail Went Cold. Keel and Emiko Morita went viral within weeks." Armchair detectives dissected Keel's hiking gear. Satellite imagery was overanalyzed. Someone even suggested Naomi's grief looked too rehearsed on TV. Meanwhile, she sat alone in a house full of half-finished lullabies and unopened birthday cards. By spring of the following year, the Moritas were a cautionary tale, a cracked photo frame in the Park Service's unsolved files. The official theory, circulated quietly, was tragic but practical. Keel must have slipped from the trail. Maybe a twisted ankle. Maybe a bear. Maybe he tucked Emiko close and crawled into the underbrush to die under the pines. The child carrier, a red Kelty Pathfinder 3.0, became legend. Stories spread among trail regulars and rangers. Whispers of a flash of red deep in the trees. One claimed their dog wouldn't stop barking at a cave mouth. Another swore they heard a baby crying far off trail. Ranger Van dismissed them gently but firmly. The Smokies were full of echoes and tricks of the light. But in hushed tones over campfires and ranger desks, one phrase kept surfacing. The mountain didn't take them, something else did. On the 5th anniversary of the disappearance, a small memorial was held in the same ranger station where Naomi had once waited for news. She didn't attend. Instead, she hiked alone to an overlook facing the southern ridges. She sat beneath a bent pine, clutching the last photo ever taken of Emiko. Chubby cheeks, a smear of yogurt, Keel's hand steadying her head. Naomi didn't cry. She whispered a promise into wind. I will find you. But the years marched on. The world forgot. Then, in the late summer of 2023, a call came in from a mountaintop, above tree line, far beyond the original search radius. 3 geology students had found something wedged in stone, red, weathered, familiar, the kind of thing that wasn't just left behind. It had been hidden. It was supposed to be a field trip. Just 3 undergrads from the University of North Carolina, up in the high southern ridges to collect mineral samples and map metamorphic strata for a senior project. They weren't thinking about missing hikers. They were thinking about grades, gear, and how to finish before the afternoon storm rolled in. But on the second day, while scrambling across a broken saddle courtside in shale, one of them, Alicia, slipped and caught herself on something that felt wrong. It wasn't a rock. It was a strap, woven nylon, frayed at the edges, red faded to rust, tucked deep in a narrow crevice between 2 sloping boulders. She pulled back a few branches and saw the outline, a backpack, wedged in so tightly it must have been shoved, or crashed, into place with force. At first, they thought it was trash, leftover gear, maybe someone careless or unlucky. But then Alicia noticed a logo, a brand she recognized, one that had burned itself into her memory after a true crime podcast episode kept her awake weeks earlier. Kelty Pathfinder 3.0. She stepped back, her breath caught. She whispered, "This is the baby carrier." The others didn't believe her until they saw the patch, a faded round sunburst stitched into the side pocket. The same patch the Morita family had mentioned in every interview, every missing persons bulletin. The same patch Keel had added during a summer trip to Bryce Canyon, commemorating Emiko's first hike. It had been 5 years. They took photos, GPS coordinates. No one dared touch it further. By nightfall, the Park Service had locked the area down. Ranger Elias then stood at the edge of the crevice with his jaw clenched. He hadn't seen the pack yet, not in person. When the photo first came through his department's email, he closed his office door and sat in silence. It had been years since he let himself imagine a break in the case. Now the pack sat 20 feet away, suspended in time. He watched as 2 forensic techs in gloves and harnesses moved slowly toward it, documenting every angle. A light mist clung to the rocks, making everything look unreal, like a stage set for a tragedy. One of the techs called out, "We're ready." With utmost care, they lifted the backpack from the crevice. It came loose easier than expected. Too easily, given how long it was supposedly lodged there. Van crouched beside it, inspecting the fabric, the zippers, the shoulder straps. "It's in better shape than it should be," he murmured. The lead forensic analyst, Dr. Marisol Vance, nodded slowly. "Way better." The carrier was flown by helicopter to a lab facility used by the Park Service in collaboration with a local university. A chain of custody was established. The bag was examined, photographed, cataloged. Nothing inside pointed definitively to the present. No receipts, no electronics, just remnants of what might have been there 5 years earlier. A moldy pacifier, a corroded canister of baby formula, a water-damaged stuffed bear with one eye missing. But the story wasn't in the contents. It was in the condition. That's what started the second storm. Dr. Vance ran the first battery of tests herself. She was meticulous, unshakable, not prone to wild theories. But the results unsettled her. The nylon color, still visibly red, was the first anomaly. She used a spectrometer to examine UV damage. The dyes should have been degraded nearly to gray or pale orange after years of sun exposure. But they weren't. The fading was consistent with months, not years. Next came the tensile strength tests. Nylon and polyester fibers, when exposed to mountain elements, especially freeze-thaw cycles and UV rays, degrade. They become brittle. But this backpack straps and seam still held nearly full strength. Weathering was present, but minimal. Most damning of all, the foam padding. The shoulder and hip pads were cut open under sterile conditions. The foam inside was shockingly intact. No waterlogging, no mold bloom, no microbial decay. In 5 years of rain, snowmelt, and humidity, that kind of preservation was almost impossible. It suggested one thing. The pack hadn't been out there all that time. Dr. Vance compiled her findings into a report. By the time she sent it to Ranger Van and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, her conclusion was clear and concise. Based on condition analysis of UV exposure, fiber degradation, and internal foam stability, the backpack in question could not have been located at the discovery site for longer than a few months. Its condition is inconsistent with 5 years of exposure at a high-elevation outdoor environment. It had been stored elsewhere, likely indoors, dry and protected. Van read the report twice. Then again. Then he stood up, walked to a whiteboard in his office where a faded map of the 2018 search grid still hung, and stared at the red circle that had marked the last known location. He drew a second circle around the geology student's discovery site. Then he connected them with a line. A river didn't run between them, but something else might have. In an emergency meeting, Van gathered a new team of specialists. This time, not SAR professionals, but hydrologists and mountain weather experts. We need to think like water, he told them, not like hikers. A radical new theory had begun to form. Something had moved the backpack, and not by human hands. They dug into meteorological archives, past flood patterns, soil saturation. Then they found it, a storm event buried in an old report that had occurred 4 months before the backpack was discovered. A thunderstorm had stalled over the southern range for nearly 4 hours in March 2023, dropping more than 8 inches of rain in a concentrated window, a once-in-a-generation deluge. Trails were destroyed, bridges swept away, entire valleys temporarily turned into rivers. Flash flooding. Could it have flushed the backpack out from wherever it had been hidden? Van leaned over the table, tapping a high-resolution map. This wasn't a resting place. It was a delivery point. A hush settled over the room. If the backpack had been hidden, the storm had torn it free. If the storm carried it downstream, then the real hiding place was still upstream. The team moved fast. Topographical data was fed into high-power simulations. LiDAR scans created 3D terrain models. Every plausible flood path was rendered and tested against variables: slope, water velocity, weight, and buoyancy of a waterlogged pack. The program ran for 2 days straight. Each time, it returned to the same origin point, a deep, rugged basin several miles from the trail system, an area known on old park maps as Widow's Grief. It had been marked in 2018 as a low-probability zone. No one had gone in, not until now. For 2 days, the simulation ran, a digital reconstruction of chaos. Not guesses, not gut instinct, just math, physics, and raw environmental data. Water levels, soil erosion factors, precipitation patterns, gravity-fed runoff models. The hydrologists mapped the storm's fury with terrifying precision. The goal wasn't to find a person anymore. It was to trace the path of an object. The red backpack, once thought to be a tragic tombstone, was now something entirely different. A messenger, a clue released from hiding by the brute force of nature. If they could track where it came from, they could find where Kale and Emiko had vanished. Again, it was Ranger Elias Van who said it first. The flood didn't just move the pack. It exposed a secret. The simulation pointed upstream to a remote, V-shaped drainage basin carved between jagged ridgelines. It had no formal name on modern maps, just a historical nickname written in faded ink on a topographic chart from the 1950s. Widow's Grief. The name was more than just poetic. It had earned its reputation. The basin was a geological trap, a choked labyrinth of granite spires, tangled laurel, and deadfall. Helicopters couldn't land. Drones couldn't fly far enough. The canopy was too thick, the GPS unreliable. It had been barely brushed by the original 2018 search, ruled out as too far off course and too improbable a destination for an experienced hiker with a toddler. Now it was the only place that made sense. Elias Van handpicked the entry team. No volunteers this time. No good intentions. No weekend warriors. This was a mission for specialists. 3 of the park's most elite rangers, a vertical rescue expert, and a wilderness paramedic. Their objective was clear and sobering. Find the origin. Find the place where the backpack waited. Find Cale. They entered Widow's Grief Basin at dawn. Their gear paired to essentials. Their nerves taut. There were no trails. No game tracks. Just raw, primeval mountain. They moved slow like ghosts. The deeper they pushed, the older the world felt. Moss hung like skin off dying trees. The ground sloshed in places, dry in others, never predictable. The air smelled of wet stone and something else. Something ancient like rotten time. Every step cost energy. Every vertical scramble demanded trust in handholds that looked suspect. They followed the high water marks. Scars on tree trunks. Silt packed into cracks between rocks. A log jammed and probably high into AV between 2 boulders. Clues left behind not by man but by torrent. They moved like detectives working a crime scene no one had known existed. On the 3rd morning, they found it. It was Leo Paris, 26 climber, ex-military, who spotted the anomaly. A wall of rhododendron clung to the eastern cliff face like a curtain. Thick, impassable. But Leo had a climber's eye. A different sense of space. He saw something deeper. A fold of shadow where there shouldn't have been one. A trick of geometry. The way the leaves bowed slightly inward. He said one word over the radio. Possible structure. It took 10 minutes of cutting, sweating, and swearing before the team broke through. What they uncovered didn't look like much. Just a crack in the cliff. Narrow, low. A fissure barely 4 feet high and 5 feet wide. But when Van climbed up to peer inside, everything changed. The air inside was still. Cool. Undisturbed. No animals. No insects. Just stone and silence. The light from his headlamp cut through the gloom and landed on something in the back. Something unmistakably human. A skeleton. Lying on its side, knees drawn up, almost peaceful. As if it curled there and never moved again. The bones were bleached but whole. A tattered scrap of weatherproof jacket clung to the rib cage. A rusted watch sat on what remained of the wrist. Van exhaled, a sound that caught in his throat. They had found Cale. The team paused. This wasn't just evidence. This was a man. A father. The wilderness paramedic, Natalie Cruz, approached with reverence. No rush. No chatter. She examined the remains with practiced care. Her voice was soft when she finally spoke. Pelvis is shattered. Right femur too. Spiral fracture. She paused. He fell. From high. Van glanced up the cliff wall above the shelter. 100 vertical feet. No handholds. No signs of a trail. Just raw rock. Cale had fallen. Probably while scouting or climbing for a better vantage. Maybe carrying Emiko. Maybe not. He had survived the fall long enough to crawl into the only cover for miles. A shelter invisible to the world. And there he had died, alone. But what chilled Van wasn't the solitude. It was what the shelter didn't contain. No sign of Emiko. No baby carrier. No tiny shoes. No child's remains. Just Cale. And something else. Near the mouth of the shelter, embedded in compacted soil, a text trowel struck metal. They assumed it was trash at first. A buried buckle. A rusted part of Cale's gear. But as the object was unearthed, a strange silence fell over the group. It was a tool. Crude. Heavy. Hand-forged iron. A small digging implement like a hoe, but with a short, curved blade and a stout wooden handle. Not hiking equipment. Not survival gear. A sengho. And the handle. It was wrapped in faded green electrical tape, woven with a pattern so precise it looked like ritual. Ranger Van crouched and stared at it for a long time. He had seen this before. Not the tool, not the blade, but the tape. The unique pattern. A wrapping he had once confiscated from a pair of locals 5 years earlier. People he'd ticketed for illegal camping near the park boundaries. Small-time troublemakers. Suspected poachers. He said their names aloud, softly. The Havers. He looked down at the rusted Sangho. This didn't belong to Cale Morita. Cale hadn't been alone. The forensic team descended on the site 2 days later by airlift. The cave was sealed, cataloged, and declared a potential crime scene. The Sangho was sent for analysis, prints, DNA, trace evidence, but the years had stripped it clean. Still, the construction of the handle was evidence enough. Van dug into old files, handwritten citations, photos of confiscated gear, and in one, dated summer 2016, there it was, a nearly identical Sangho. Same blade, same green-wrapped handle, same maker's marks. Confiscated from a couple named Oren and Mira Haver. Frequent violators, suspected ginseng poachers, though never charged. Van stared at the photo for a long time. Then he looked again at the map. The Havers' last known address was 20 miles from the trailhead. They'd moved out of state 6 months after Cale and Emiko disappeared. He didn't say it aloud, but everyone in the room felt the weight of the unspoken question. If Cale died alone in that cave, where was Emiko, and who took her? The evidence had drawn a line in the soil, a rusted artifact buried at the threshold of death. The Sangho, the green tape, the unmistakable fingerprint of another presence in that hidden shelter. Cale Morita had not died alone, and his daughter, Emiko, had not died with him. It was now impossible to ignore. The case was no longer about a missing father and child. It had become a potential crime. The discovery of the Sangho collapsed the comfortable tragedy they had all built in their minds. No longer heroic father lost the elements, no longer a simple act of misadventure. There was now a dark possibility. Someone had been there, had seen Cale broken and dying, and had chosen to walk away. Or worse, had taken something with them. Emiko. The question that gripped every investigator was no longer what had happened. It was where had she gone? And it began again with the river. Ranger Elias Van returned to the Park Command Center, his thoughts racing. They had used flood simulations to trace the backpack's final journey downstream. But now, they would have to reverse the path. The cave wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. They fed every scrap of data they had back into the hydrological model. Only this time, the question wasn't where the flood had delivered the backpack, but where it might have taken it from. The starting point was a cave. The Sangho had likely fallen from a pocket or pack during the Havers' exit, possibly the very night Cale died. They pulled new environmental data from the March 2023 storm. Using LiDAR scans and rainfall intensity curves, the tech team reconstructed the ghost of a flash flood. This wasn't a river you could walk beside. This was a violent, fleeting thing, an angry torrent born from the sky that would vanish as quickly as it appeared. They adjusted the algorithm to factor in debris mobility, object mass, and water velocity. The backpack weighed over 20 pounds with its contents. It wouldn't have floated. It would have tumbled, dragged, sunk, surged forward only when enough water lifted it free. When the first simulation completed, the screen was crisscrossed with threads, potential flood routes. But one was bold, dominant. A path carved from the very heart of Widow's Grief Basin. The coordinates it began from sent a chill through Van's spine. The source zone was an older geological scar, a tight culvert where 3 tributaries converge into a bowl-like depression before surging downhill. It had a name only the oldest park staff still remembered. Deadfall Hollow. No trails reached it. No tourists photographed it. It was a cul-de-sac of wilderness, dark, choked with brambles, shaded by cliffs. The kind of place you'd only ever reach if you were lost, desperate, or hiding. If the backpack had begun there, what else had? The team returned to the field. Same crew, same gear, but this time, the emotional stakes had hardened into focus. They weren't just looking for remains now. They were looking for evidence. They reached Deadfall Hollow on the second day. No path marked the entrance, just a narrowing gully that twisted between stunted trees and silent stone. Everything about the place felt wrong. Too quiet, too still, Van moved at the front, sweeping his flashlight beneath overhangs, scanning for unnatural shapes. The soil here was rich and undisturbed. No footprints, no human trash, just spiderwebs and decay. Then Cruz, the medic, called out, "Got something." They gathered at the base of a half-collapsed cedar tree. Beneath its roots was a shallow recess, nearly invisible unless you were looking from below. Inside were faded scraps of blue nylon, a different backpack. This one was shredded, half consumed by rot, but still clung to shape. Van gently pulled it free. No bones, no personal items, just the rusted remnants of zippers and straps. And tucked in the bottom, a faded pacifier, pink with a tiny rubber star. Someone had been here, a child. Then came the second discovery. 20 yards upslope. It wasn't gear. It was a hollow, a shallow overhang carved into the rock wall, barely 4 feet deep. It had been used as shelter. The signs were faint but undeniable. Packed earth, flattened leaves, soot marks on the stone from a tiny fire. Someone had stayed here. Not camped, hidden. No bones. No blood. But in a corner, buried beneath an inch of debris, a tattered red baby jacket. The same color as the original carrier. And beneath it, folded almost reverently, a torn photo. The kind printed at home, faded with sun and time. The image showed a man holding a baby girl, smiling at the camera. The same face that now existed only in dental records and memory. Cale Morita. It was the last piece they needed. Cale hadn't fallen with Emiko in his arms. He had hidden her here, before the fall, before the Sangho, before he died in the cave. The rest of the theory fell into place with quiet horror. The Havers had not found Cale and Emiko together. They had found her first. Then Cale injured, begging, pleading. And in that moment, whether out of fear, impulse, or something darker, they had taken her. The original sin. Back at HQ, Van stood at the whiteboard and sketched out the timeline. October 2018, Cale and Emiko vanish. Days later, Cale is injured, crawls to shelter, dies alone. Same window. Havers illegally digging the basin. Find Emiko and Cale. They take Emiko, leave the Sangho behind, disappear. March 2023. Historic flood strikes. Backpack washed from storage. Summer 2023. Backpack discovered. Investigation reignites. Van drew a red circle around one phrase. They took her. The hydrologists had uncovered more than terrain. They had uncovered truth. The Havers had been ghosts for 5 years. But no ghost lives without a trace. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation re-entered the case. Public records traced the Havers' exit, first to a rented trailer in West Virginia, then a small property in Kentucky. No forwarding address, no online presence. They paid in cash. They stayed quiet. No arrests, no missing persons reports. Just a couple with a child they never had a right to raise. And one last disturbing detail. Neighbors described the girl. Dark hair, quiet, sweet. About 6 years old. Her name? Elsie. Not Emiko. Not anymore. The race to find her began with urgency. But it wasn't about handcuffs. It was about trauma. About protection. About doing this the right way. Because if Elsie was Emiko, she wouldn't know it. Wouldn't remember her real father. Wouldn't recognize the name Akari Morita. She'd only know the people who had taken her as Mom and Dad. And when that illusion shattered, it had to be done with care. The next step had to be soft. Not a raid, but a knock. It was a gray Kentucky morning when the unmarked vehicle turned off the main road and began climbing the winding dirt path. The tires kicked up pebbles along a rutted trail hemmed in by pine and thicket. At the top sat a house barely holding itself together. White paint peeling, porch sagging, windows cracked but curtained. Ranger Elias Van sat in the front passenger seat, his boots muddy, his badge tucked into his coat. Beside him were 2 agents from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. No uniforms, no guns visible, just soft voices and hard questions. They weren't there for a bust. They were there for a reckoning. The Havers house was exactly what the reports had described. Remote, cluttered, forgotten. A rusted tricycle leaned against the side of the porch. Children's boots, far too small, were lined up beneath the windowsill like offerings. When they pulled in, a curtain moved. Quickly, nervously, Van stepped out first. He adjusted the evidence bag in his hand. Inside, the hand-forged Sangho with the fading green electrical tape that had cracked this case open, a tool that had once been used to dig for stolen roots and had now unearthed something far more profound. He climbed the wooden steps and knocked. The door opened 2 inches. A chain caught it. Quentin Haver's face appeared through the gap, older than Van remembered, gaunt, unshaven, eyes sunk too deep into his skull. "We're not buying anything," he said flatly. "We're not selling," one agent answered gently. "We're here about an incident in the Smokies." October 2018. Quentin's eyes flicked to the evidence bag. A flicker. Fear? Memory? Recognition? "I don't know what you're talking about. We ain't been there in years." He started to shut the door, but the agent placed his palm gently against it. No pressure, just presence. From inside the house, a woman's voice called out, "Quint, who is it?" And then she appeared behind him. Elena Haver, thin, tired, her once dark hair gone gray at the roots. She wore a faded sweatshirt. Her eyes widened as she looked past the men to the object in Van's hand. The Sangho. It hung there in the bag like a ghost. Elena's body recoiled as if struck. Her breath caught. A sharp sound. A gasp that broke into a sob. Her knees buckled, and she grabbed the doorframe to stay upright. Quentin didn't speak. He didn't have to. The silence was a confession. He unlatched the chain and stepped back. Van and the agents entered the house. The inside was sparse but clean. Worn linoleum floors. A couch with mismatched cushions. A small kitchen with a humming refrigerator that had seen better days. And peeking out from a back hallway, a little girl. Dark hair, pale skin, wide, uncertain eyes. She looked at Van, then at her mother, then vanished back down the hall as Elena whispered something soft and broken under her breath. The agents didn't push. They let the weight of the moment settle. And then the story spilled out. They hadn't planned to become kidnappers. It was supposed to be a day trip, a risky one, yes, but a lucrative one. The roots they pulled from the soil were worth hundreds per pound overseas. American ginseng, Appalachia's secret gold. Illegal, but vital for people like them. Scraping by on the edge of survival. They were near the base of Widow's Grief Basin, packing up their haul when they heard the sound. A cry, faint, muffled, but not animal. They followed it. That's when they found her. The baby was maybe 8 months old, wrapped in a torn hiking jacket, her cheeks red with cold, but her lungs strong enough to scream. She was alone. They thought at first that her father had abandoned her, or died, but then they saw the blood trail, the broken brush, the desperate footprints dragging toward a rocky slope. Quentin went ahead, while Elena stayed with the child. He found Cale Morita just before dusk, lying on his side in a rock crevice, shivering, leg twisted, face pale with shock. He was dying, and he knew it. He didn't beg for rescue. He begged for one thing only. "Save her," he whispered. "Please, take her." They didn't know his name, didn't ask for it. They panicked. They weren't supposed to be there. They were poaching. Again, if they got caught, even trying to help, they feared the law wouldn't care, wouldn't believe them, would take everything. So they took the child. They took the red carrier, too. There were diapers and a bottle inside, a backpack full of small necessities. And they left Cale with their water bottle. They didn't stay to watch him die. They made it out of the basin by morning, the child asleep in Elena's arms. She never cried again after they left the woods, as if something ancient had quieted inside her. They told themselves they would do the right thing, leave her with a church, or a hospital, somewhere safe. But they didn't. They kept driving. One day became 2, then a week. She smiled at them, clung to Elena, took her first steps on their kitchen floor, called Quentin before she ever said Mama. They named her Elsie. They moved twice that year, told no one, burned the carrier in a steel barrel. But the Sangho, they had forgotten it. They thought no one would ever find the shelter. Quentin stopped talking halfway through confession. Elena finished it. Her face was streaked with tears. She didn't try to wipe them. She became our life, she whispered. I know it was wrong. I know, but she was all we had. They never mistreated her, never locked her away. But their love had grown out of theft, and it had eaten them alive. Every time a ranger car passed on a highway, every time they saw a missing poster on TV, they knew it could all come crashing down. But they hadn't expected this. The Havers were taken into custody without resistance. There was no shouting, no handcuffing in front of the child. A social worker, trained in high-trauma retrievals, entered gently, sat on the floor, and told Elsie a story. That her parents had to go away for a while. That she would be staying with some very kind people. She didn't cry. She packed her favorite book. She asked if she could bring her shoes. The DNA sample came back in 24 hours. It was a match. Elsie Haver was Emiko Morita, the girl who had vanished in the wilderness with her father 5 years ago. The story was over, and a new one was about to begin. The call came just after sunrise. Akari Morita had already been awake for hours, staring at the framed photo on her kitchen counter, the one she never put away. Her husband, Cale, grinning with a baby strapped to his chest, both of them squinting against the sun somewhere in the Smokies. It was the last photo she had received before they vanished. When her phone buzzed, she didn't rush to answer. She'd gotten too many calls from too many people over the years. Detectives, journalists, strangers offering visions and dreams. Most of them meant well. Some didn't. All of them left her with nothing but silence and aching hope. But this call was different. She picked up. A man's voice introduced himself. Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. He sounded tired, gentle, like someone who had spent years chasing a ghost and finally found it sitting quietly in the daylight. Mrs. Morita, he said, I want to tell you 2 things. The first is, we found your husband. The silence on the line was immediate and deafening. Akari pressed her palm to the countertop. Her knees wobbled. She didn't cry. Not yet. He's gone, the voice continued. But we found him. He didn't die in vain. He saved your daughter. Then came the second thing. We found Emiko. She's alive. And then she collapsed. The sob tore through her from somewhere ancient. Years of mourning colliding with the impossible spark of life reignited. There was no simple way to prepare for what followed. The logistics alone took days, custody transitions, DNA verification, psychological assessments. And then there was the emotional architecture. How do you reunite a mother with a child who has no memory of her? Emiko, Elsie, as she still called herself, was calm through most of it. That worried the specialist more than anything. She didn't cry. She didn't ask many questions. But she listened carefully to everything. She was told, in the gentlest terms possible, that the people she had known as parents weren't really her parents, and that somewhere far away was a woman who had been waiting for her every single day of her life. The reunion was set for the following week in a small office within the Department of Child Services. No cameras, no press, just a therapist, a caseworker, and 2 chairs, one for Akari, one for Emiko. Akari arrived first. She was dressed simply, no makeup, her hair pulled back, hands shaking in her lap. The room was too quiet. Time stretched. Then the door opened. Emiko stepped in, holding the caseworker's hand. Her hair was brushed. She wore a pale blue hoodie and corduroy pants. She didn't look frightened, just cautious, studying the woman across the room like a puzzle that almost made sense. Akari stood slowly. Her breath caught. For a full 5 seconds, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice so soft it was barely there, Akari said, "Hi, baby." Emiko tilted her head. "You knew my daddy," she said. Akari nodded. "I did. He was everything." There were no tears at first, just observation. Emiko approached her carefully, like someone approaching a skittish animal. She stopped just short of her. "Did he die saving me?" "Yes," Akari whispered, her voice breaking. "He loved you more than anything. He gave everything to protect you." There was a long pause. Then Emiko did something no one expected. She reached out and placed her small hand in Akari's. The days that followed were a balancing act between familiarity and distance. Akari had to fight every instinct to pull Emiko into her arms and never let go. But she didn't. She followed the specialist's instructions: patience, honesty, structure. She answered every question Emiko had, no matter how small or strange. "Why didn't you come find me?" "I tried. Every day. We looked. So many people looked. But you were hidden." "Why did they take me?" Akari swallowed. "Because they were scared. But it wasn't your fault. None of this was your fault." Emiko nodded slowly. She didn't say much after that. But that night, when Akari tucked her in at the foster home, Emiko whispered, "Can you stay?" Akari said, "I'll stay as long as you want me to." Quentin and Elena have her pled guilty. The charges were complex: child abduction, failure to report a death, obstruction. But the court acknowledged what they weren't: abusers. They hadn't harmed Emiko. They hadn't locked her away or subjected her to cruelty. They had raised her as best they could, albeit under a foundation of fear and deception. Their sentence reflected that: prison time, but not a life sentence. They didn't resist. Elena's only request was a letter, a final note for Emiko. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was a goodbye. "We loved you, even if we didn't deserve to. And we hope one day you can be happy, really happy, with your real mama. She waited a long time to find you." The world moved on, but the Morita's story lingered in the public consciousness. Some called it a miracle. Some called it a tragedy. Akari called it both. She and Emiko, still Elsie in her own head, began the slow process of rediscovery. It wasn't like turning on a light. It was more like building a fire from embers, small, careful moments of warmth built day by day. They started with short visits, then overnights, then a shared apartment, where Emiko decorated her own room in the colors she liked, yellow and teal. There were therapy sessions. There were tears. There were nights when Emiko asked for the Havers in her sleep. And there were mornings when she whispered "Mama" and meant Akari. 1 year later, Emiko stood beside her mother at a memorial in the Smoky Mountains. They had hiked, just a short trail, nothing dangerous. Akari brought flowers. They stood at a quiet overlook facing Widow's Grief Basin. A small plaque had been placed there in Kale's honor. Emiko didn't say much. She just stood with her hand in her mother's, staring out over the trees. Then she whispered, "I remember his voice. I think." Akari smiled, eyes wet. He was kind. Emiko said, "Like you." The file was closed. Not with fanfare or press conferences, but with a quiet notation in the digital records of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Case 18-1102, status: resolved. There were no more leads to chase. No more trails to hike. No more spectral evidence left buried in dirt and time. But for those who lived the story, who bled in it, who wept through it, resolution was not a destination. It was a strange, fragile place to begin again. For Akari and Emiko Morita, life became something softer, quieter, yet never truly ordinary. They moved to Asheville, not too far from the Smokies, but far enough to breathe. Akari took a job at a small environmental nonprofit. Emiko started school under her real name. She was quiet, observant. Teachers called her thoughtful. Friends called her kind. She didn't speak much about the past, but she drew, constantly. Notebooks filled with wild forest red backpacks, rivers cutting through mountains. And always, a tall man with gentle eyes and a crooked smile. "I don't remember his voice anymore," she once told Akari. "But I remember the way I felt when he held me, like everything was okay." Akari smiled, brushed the hair from her daughter's face. "That's the part that stays," she said. "The feeling." Back in Tennessee, Ranger Orion Vance Ash retired quietly the following spring. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't seek recognition. He simply turned in his badge, packed a lifetime of maps and field journals into 2 cardboard boxes, and left his office for the last time. He hadn't intended to stay with the case so long. There had been other tragedies, other searches, but something about the Moritas had latched onto him. a father's courage, a mother's hope, a child vanished into mist and silence, the discovery of the Sango, the confession in Kentucky, the digital simulations that turned water into a messenger of truth. It had all changed him. He moved to a cabin near Fontana Lake, trading ranger briefings for fishing lines and early morning fog. But some nights he still walked the ridgelines. He didn't look for anything anymore. He just listened. At the National Forensics Conference the following year, Dr. Halen Vex presented a case study titled Hydrological Drift as an Indicator of Human Activity in Remote Terrain, a case application. Most attendees didn't realize it was based on a real case. The red backpack, the spectral dye analysis, the foam that resisted 5 winters. It became a gold standard in forensic hydrology, what she didn't mention in her paper, but would later tell a close colleague over coffee, was this. It wasn't the science that cracked the case. It was a feeling that the mountain was holding something. And then the storm came, and it let go. Quentin and Elena Haver were eligible for parole after 4 years. They never applied. By all accounts, they were model inmates. Quentin taught woodworking in the prison shop. Elena helped inmates write letters home. They received no visitors. But once a year, on Emiko's birthday, they were allowed to send a card. No return address. Just a message in careful script. We love you. We always will. Be brave. Akari never showed them to Emiko. Not yet, but she kept them, tied with a ribbon, for a time when her daughter would be old enough to understand that love, in its many forms, can be both a wound and a gift. As for Emiko, she grew. She asked questions. Some days were hard. Some nights were worse. But she was never alone. She and her mother developed rituals. Saturday pancakes, forest walks, story nights where Akari would invent wild adventures starring a fearless little girl and a kind man with a crooked smile. And sometimes on quiet nights, Akari would show her daughter the old photos. Kale holding baby Emiko on a hiking trail, eyes full of pride. That's the man who carried you through the storm, she'd say. The reason we found our way back. And Emiko would lean her head on her mother's shoulder and whisper, I miss him. Not because she remembered him in the way adults remember, but because somewhere in her bones, she still felt the echo of being loved without condition. The plaque on the overlook remained simple. In memory of Kale Morita, who braved the mountains and gave everything for the one thing that mattered. Visitors pass by. Some pause, read the name, and move on, but others linger. They feel it in the air, the sense that something was once lost here. And then, against all odds found, in the end, there was no perfect justice, no happy ending wrapped in a bow. What remained was a mosaic, fractured, beautiful, and true. A man died alone, but not forgotten. A child was taken, but not destroyed. A mother never gave up, and because of that, a life was rebuilt. And the mountain, silent as ever, kept its secrets until the rain came. The red backpack, once thought to be the final clue, was merely a beginning, a silent witness carried on the back of a flood, a drift marker on the river of memory, a quiet whisper saying, keep going. The truth is just downstream. If stories like this move you, if you're drawn to the mysteries hidden in forgotten places and the quiet courage of those who never stop searching, subscribe for more true crime that goes beyond headlines and into the human heart. Your next story is already unfolding.